I onda je mama htjela da ostane sa svojom majkom, ali pošto sam ja bila sa njom, ja sam kazala pa imaš za koga da živiš i na kraju ja 14,5 godina, šta da vam pričam, i onda ima mama za koga da živi, osim toga tata je u zarobljeništvu, moj brat je negde u Italiji i nekako ona teška srca se oprostila od bake koji su utovarili na otvoreni kamion. Ja dalje ne znam.
Kad je došlo vrijeme da sad otle kupe malu djecu. Jer ima tu male djece koliko Bog hoće. I kažem ti, došao kamion pred onom, kapiju. Tamo i kupe.
It was December 1941 when everything changed. Jenny Lebel, a 14-year-old Jewish girl in Belgrade, stood in her cramped apartment, clutching the official order that had been shoved under their door. All Jews must report to the police station for resettlement. The words seemed to dance on the page, cold and final. Jenny's heart raced. She had heard whispers of what resettlement meant, of families packed into cattle cars, of people disappearing into camps and never returning. Her father, Leon, had been one of them, taken months earlier as a prisoner of war to Germany. Jenny and her mother, Anna, had been clinging to a thin thread of hope, hiding in plain sight, barely surviving. But now the thread had snapped. She glanced at her mother, Anna, who sat trembling in a chair, the color drained from her face. This was it. This was how it would all end. But then, something inside Jenny sparked, a tiny, fierce flame of defiance. She wasn't going to walk obediently into the arms of death. She couldn't. Not like this. Her father was already gone. She and her mother had survived on the edges of society, scraping by, evading capture, keeping their heads down. But now, with this order in her hand, Jenny knew they had to act, or die trying. "Mama," Jenny whispered, turning to her mother, who was staring vacantly at the paper. "We can't go to the station, we have to run." Anna's face crumpled. "Run? But where? We're alone. There's no one left to help us." There was only one place Jenny could think of, one person who might, just might, help. She remembered her kindergarten teacher, Jelena Glavaški, back in Nish. Jenny hadn't seen her in years, not since the family had moved to Belgrade, but she remembered the warmth in the woman's eyes, the kindness in her smile. If anyone would be willing to take her in, it would be Jelena. It was a slim hope, but it was all she had. "I'll go to Nish," Jenny whispered fiercely. "I'll find Jelena." Anna looked at her, horror and helplessness warring in her expression. "It's too dangerous," she murmured, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They'll find you." "Better to take my chances out there than to walk into that station," Jenny replied softly but firmly. She leaned forward, grasping her mother's hand. "Mama, you have to believe me. I have to try." And so, the next morning, while the rest of the city cowered in fear, Jenny slipped through the streets, keeping to the shadows, heart hammering in her chest as she made her way to the train station. She bought a ticket with the last of their money, praying that the station guards wouldn't stop her, that no one would notice the star sewn onto her coat. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the ground, and when the train doors closed behind her, she let out a shuddering breath. Every fiber of her being was tense, coiled, ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. But no one stopped her. No one noticed. She was invisible. Hours passed. Each minute stretched like an eternity. The countryside blurred past the window, but Jenny's mind was miles away, racing with what-ifs. What if Jelena refused her? What if the teacher wasn't there anymore? What if... She shook the thoughts away, focusing instead on the tiny flicker of hope that kept her going. It was fragile, wavering in the cold darkness, but it was all she had. When she finally arrived in Nish, the sun had long since set. The streets were empty, the town eerily quiet under the cover of darkness. Jenny made her way to Jelena's house, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. She hesitated at the gate, staring up at the darkened windows. Was this madness? Should she just run and try to survive on her own? But then the door opened, spilling light onto the path, and Jenny found herself face to face with Jelena Glavaški. The older woman's face softened in recognition, her eyes widening in shock as she took in the sight of Jenny standing there, alone and shivering in the cold. "Jenny?" she breathed, stepping forward. My God, Jenny Liebel? Jenny didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded, tears burning her eyes. I didn't know where else to go. Jelena's gaze flickered over Jenny's thin frame, taking in the fear etched into every line of her face. Without another word, she reached out and pulled the girl into her arms, holding her tightly. You did the right thing, she murmured softly. You're safe now. Come inside. But even as she spoke, Jelena knew that the word safe was a tenuous promise. By taking Jenny in, she was risking everything. Her home, her freedom, her life. Yet looking into Jenny's desperate eyes, there was no hesitation. The Nazis had already taken too much. She wouldn't let them have this girl too. Over the next few weeks, Jelena transformed her home into a sanctuary. She led Jenny to a small, cramped attic, hidden behind a false wall, and turned it into a secret refuge. They moved in silence, speaking only in whispers, as if raising their voices would somehow summon the Gestapo to their door. Jelena brought food, books, and even a few small trinkets to make the space feel less like a prison. She spent long hours in the evening sitting by Jenny's side, telling stories of better times, of a future beyond the war. But every time a knock came at the door, they both froze, hearts racing, waiting to see if this would be the end. As the months dragged on, Jelena knew they needed more than just a hiding place. They needed a way for Jenny to move freely, to escape if things became too dangerous. That's when Jelena took her most daring step yet. She forged new identification papers for Jenny, transforming her into a Christian Serbian girl named Ivana Jovanović. It was a risky, painstaking process, one that could get them both killed if discovered. But Jelena did it without flinching, her hands steady even as her heart pounded with fear. With the new papers, Jenny began to venture out in short bursts, her pulse hammering with each step. She practiced her new identity, her new name, until it rolled off her tongue with ease. For a while, it seemed like they had outsmarted the Nazis. But in war, safety is always fleeting. One cold evening in February 1943, the illusion of security shattered. There was a pounding at the door, followed by angry shouts. Jenny's blood ran cold. Jelena glanced at her, eyes wide with terror. "Hide," she whispered, pushing Jenny toward the attic. "Go!" Jenny scrambled up the narrow staircase, pressing herself against the far wall. She could hear the shouts below, the sound of boots stomping through the house. "Where is she?" a voice bellowed. "We know you're hiding a Jew, you filthy traitor." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jelena replied, her voice trembling but defiant. They ransacked the house, ripping through cupboards, tearing open drawers, overturning furniture. Jenny clamped her hands over her mouth, her entire body shaking. They would find her. It was only a matter of time. And then, the trap door was yanked open, and a hand reached in, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her out into the harsh light. Jelena screamed as they hauled Jenny down the stairs, throwing her onto the floor at their feet. "No!" she cried, reaching for her, but a rifle butt slammed into her ribs, knocking her to the ground. "This is what happens to those who harbor Jews," the officer sneered, glancing down at Jenny with a look of pure contempt. "Take them both." The journey to the prison was a blur of pain and fear. Jenny and Jelena were dragged into a dark, damp cell, the air heavy with the stench of despair. Jenny huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. Jelena knelt beside her, whispering softly, even as her own body shook from the terror coursing through her veins. "I'm sorry," Jenny sobbed. "I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have come." "No," Jelena murmured fiercely, taking the girl's face in her hands. "Don't you ever apologize for surviving. You are not to blame. This is not your fault." But survival, Jenny would soon learn, was a fragile thing. Over the next few days, they were interrogated relentlessly. The soldiers demanded names, addresses, anything that would lead them to others like Jenny. Each time, Jenny shook her head, fear clawing at her throat, refusing to speak. When Jenny refused to talk, they turned on Jelena, beating her until she was barely conscious. Yet, through it all, the teacher never broke. "I'll tell you nothing," Jelena whispered through split lips, her voice weak but unbroken. "You can kill me, but you'll get nothing." The beatings grew worse, each one more brutal than the last. Jenny watched in horror as Jelena was dragged from the cell day after day, only to be thrown back hours later, her body bruised and bloodied. But Jelena's spirit remained unbroken. Even when her voice was too weak to speak, she would lock eyes with Jenny, and the fierce determination in her gaze spoke louder than words. You are worth fighting for. Finally, Jenny was separated from her protector, sent to a concentration camp in Germany. As she was dragged away, she caught one last glimpse of Jelena, broken, bleeding, but still standing, her gaze unwavering. I'll find you, Jenny whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'll find you again. But she never did. In January 1944, Jelena Glavaški was executed, her body buried in a nameless grave. When the war ended, Jenny returned to Belgrade, searching for any trace of the woman who had saved her life. But instead, she found a world that had been forever changed, her family shattered, her mother dead in the gas vans at Sajmište. The pain was overwhelming, a hollow ache that settled deep in Jenny's chest. But as she stood before the place that had once been Jelena's home, she felt something else too, a fierce, unrelenting pride. Jelena's courage hadn't been in vain. Because of her, Jenny had survived. Because of her, Jenny was still standing, yet Jelena's memory lived on. The town of Nish named a street after her, and her story was enshrined in the local museum. In 1987, Yad Vashem honored her as righteous among the nations. Because in a world filled with betrayal and fear, Jelena had stood firm, choosing to protect a young girl when doing so meant sacrificing her own life. She became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of courage in the face of unimaginable evil. And as Jenny stood before the plaque bearing Jelena's name, she knew that this was the legacy of a true hero, the quiet strength to say, "No, I will not stand by. I will protect you no matter what it costs." Because in the end, heroes aren't made in the heat of battle. They are forged in the simple, unwavering decision to stand up for what is right, even when standing up means standing alone. Jenny's own life took her far away from Serbia. She moved to Israel after the war, carrying the weight of those lost years, but she also carried the light of Jelena's sacrifice. She built a new life, started a family of her own, and raised children who would never have to live in fear of being hunted. But she never forgot. She never stopped telling Jelena's story, never stopped honoring the memory of the woman who had stood up against evil armed only with kindness and courage. When the city of Nish named a street after Jelena, Jenny traveled back, standing once again in the place that had been both a haven and a prison. She felt the weight of history pressing in on her. The memories so vivid, it was as if she could still hear Jelena's voice, whispering reassurances in the dark. But this time, the sadness was softer, gentler, because Jelena had not been forgotten. Because people would walk down that street, see her name, and remember what one person's courage could achieve. In 1987, Yad Vashem recognized Jelena Glavaški as righteous among the nations. Jenny was there for the ceremony, standing tall as they spoke of Jelena's bravery, her sacrifice. As the tree was planted in Jelena's honor, Jenny felt a deep sense of peace. This tree would grow strong, its roots digging deep, its branches reaching for the sky. It would stand as a living testament to Jelena's legacy, a symbol of hope and resilience in a world that had known so much darkness. But the story didn't end there. As Jenny's children grew, she made sure they knew about Jelena, not just as a historical figure, but as a real person, with fears and doubts, but also with a fierce resolve to do what was right. She taught them that true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's standing up in spite of it. It's opening your door when every instinct tells you to bolt it shut. It's saying, "I will protect you," even when you know it might cost you your life. Jenny's grandchildren heard these stories too. They knew that their very existence was tied to a woman they had never met, a woman who had lived and died long before they were born. And they grew up with a profound respect for the power of one person's choice, the choice to fight back against hatred, to protect the vulnerable, to make a stand, however small, against the tides of history. And so, Jelena's legacy lived on. Her story passed from generation to generation, a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. Jenny visited Yad Vashem often, standing beneath the shade of the tree planted in Jelena's honor. She would close her eyes, listening to the soft rustle of leaves, and imagine Jelena's presence beside her. The pain of loss never completely faded, but it no longer felt like a weight dragging her down. Instead, it was a reminder to keep moving forward, to keep living. Because that was what Jelena had given her. Not just life, but the strength to live it fully, to honor those who had been lost by carrying their stories with her. As the years turned into decades, Jenny's voice grew softer, her hair silvered with age, but the fire in her eyes never dimmed. She continued to speak of Jelena to anyone who would listen, sharing the story with students, with historians, with visitors to the museum. She knew that one day she too would be gone, but she wasn't afraid. Because by then Jelena's story was no longer just hers, it belonged to the world. When Jenny passed away, her family gathered beneath the tree at Yad Vashem. They stood in silence, the branches swaying gently overhead, and thought of the woman who had given them this life, this family. And they knew that Jelena was still with them, in every act of kindness, in every moment of courage. They placed a small polished stone at the base of the tree, a Jewish symbol of remembrance, and bowed their heads. "Thank you," one of Jenny's great-grandchildren whispered softly, running his fingers over the rough bark. "We won't forget." Because that, in the end, is what Jelena had fought for. Not glory, not recognition, but memory. The memory of a world that chose compassion over cruelty, humanity over hatred. And as long as that memory lived, so did she. Jelena Glavaški's story is more than just a tale of resistance. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always a choice. We can choose to be bystanders, or we can choose to be protectors. We can choose to close our doors, or we can choose to open them, to reach out to say, "Come in, I will keep you safe." Because in the end, heroes are not made in grand moments of victory or defeat. They are shaped in the quiet, unassuming choices made behind closed doors, in the trembling hands that still manage to reach out and say, "Come in, I will keep you safe." Jelena's story is not about the spotlight, or medals, or glory. It's about something deeper, about the power of ordinary people to rise to extraordinary courage when everything they love is threatened. It's about the fierce light that can burn in the heart of a school teacher, a light that no amount of darkness can ever extinguish. In the years that followed, Jenny's family continued to grow, the branches of her family tree spreading far and wide. Each child, each grandchild, and great-grandchild carried within them the legacy of survival, of resilience. Every family celebration, every moment of joy was a testament to Jelena's sacrifice. Without her, none of them would exist. Without her, an entire line of lives, of stories, of love would have been snuffed out. "Would you have done it?" Miriam whispered, looking up at her grandfather with wide, solemn eyes. "Would you have hidden someone?" He hesitated, the weight of history pressing in around them. "I would like to think I would," he said softly. "But the truth is I don't know. I hope I would have been brave enough, but I'm not sure." Miriam frowned, her gaze drifting back to the tree. "She must have been scared." "She was terrified," her grandfather replied. "But bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are. That's what Jelena did. That's why she was a hero." Miriam stared at the tree for a long time, the leaves rustling softly in the breeze. And then slowly, she stepped forward and laid a hand on the rough bark, feeling the strength of the tree beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, so softly it was almost lost in the wind. "Thank you for being brave." That night, as they stood together beneath the stars, Miriam's grandfather told her more about Jelena, about the small, cramped attic where Jenny had hidden, about the false papers that Jelena had forged, about the night they were betrayed, and how Jelena had fought, not with her fists or with weapons, but with her refusal to give up, even when the Gestapo came crashing through her door. "It's hard to imagine," Miriam murmured, glancing up at the sky. "All the things they went through." Her grandfather nodded, his gaze distant. "Yes, but that's why we have to remember. We have to tell these stories, so that what Jelena did is never forgotten." And so the story passed on, one generation to the next, each telling infused with the same quiet reverence. It became more than just a tale of survival. It became a lesson, a guiding star for Jenny's descendants, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always a choice. that even in the face of unimaginable evil, one person's courage can make all the difference. When Jenny's great-great-grandson was born, Jenny's daughter suggested a name, Jelena, to honor the woman who had made their lives possible. And so, Jelena Glavaški came into the world, her name carrying the weight of history, a living link between the past and the present. As she grew, she would hear the stories of the woman whose name she bore, of the courage and strength that had saved their family. And she too would carry the flame forward, lighting the way for future generations. Jelena's story, Jenny's story, became a part of the family's fabric, woven into every laugh, every tear, every moment of joy and sorrow. And in time, it spread beyond the family, reaching others who were searching for hope, for inspiration. It was shared in classrooms, in museums, in books and articles. People from all walks of life learned about Jelena Glavaški, the humble teacher who had stood up against the darkness and refused to bow. In Nish, the street named after Jelena became a place of pilgrimage. People came to walk its length, to stand in front of the small plaque bearing her name, to pay their respects. Some came with flowers, others with stones to leave in remembrance. And each time, as they stood there, the story would be told again. The story of how one woman's courage saved a life, and in doing so, saved countless others. Even today, Jelena's legacy continues to grow. Her name is whispered in prayers of gratitude, her story shared in classrooms around the world. She has become more than just a name on a plaque. She has become a symbol of resistance, of resilience, of the power of the human spirit to endure, to fight, to protect. Because Jelena's story is not just about what happened during the war, it's about what it means to be human. It's about the choices we make, the lines we draw, and the strength we find when we stand up for what's right. It's about saying, I will not be a bystander. I will not look away, I will act. And that perhaps is the greatest legacy of all. Because as long as there are people willing to tell her story, as long as there are those who remember what she did, Jelena Glavaški will never truly be gone. Her courage, her strength, her love, they live on in every person who is inspired by her example, in every act of kindness, in every moment of courage, in every choice to stand up and say, no, I will not stand by. Because Jelena's story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. And as long as that hope lives, so does she. In every country ravaged by war, in every era marked by oppression, there are people who choose to step forward when it would be safer to step back. People who risk everything, not because they are fearless, but because they refuse to let fear dictate their actions. And these people, these quiet heroes, are what keeps the fabric of humanity from unraveling completely. Jenny's descendants carried this message with them, spreading it far beyond the borders of Serbia. Her family became ambassadors of Jelena's legacy, sharing her story wherever they went, at Holocaust remembrance events, at community gatherings, at educational programs in Israel, Europe, and the United States. Jenny's great-granddaughter, a teacher herself, made it her mission to include Jelena's story in her history curriculum, ensuring that every student who came through her classroom knew of the woman who had stood up when so many others stayed silent. One winter evening, decades after Jenny's passing, a documentary crew visited Nish to film a special segment on Jelena's life. They interviewed people from the neighborhood, many of whom still remembered the whispers about the brave schoolteacher who had defied the Nazis. One elderly man, his eyes misting with emotion, spoke softly of how his own parents had told him about Jelena's final moments. They said she walked to her death with her head held high, he murmured, his voice trembling. Even after everything they did to her, she never begged, never broke. She looked those men in the eye, and they were the ones who looked away. The interviewer, visibly moved, asked him why he thought Jelena had done it, why she had risked everything for a young Jewish girl she hadn't seen in years. The man shook his head slowly. Because that's what it means to be human, he whispered. Because when everything else is stripped away, all we have left are the choices we make. And she chose love. Love. The word hung in the air, resonating deeply. Because that, ultimately, was what Jelena had given Jenny. Not just protection, not just safety, but love. A fierce, unyielding love that saw no divisions of race or religion. A love that transcended fear and hatred and violence. It was this love that saved Jenny. And it was this love that lived on, long after the war ended, long after Jelena's death. Years later, when one of Jenny's great-great-grandchildren decided to become a social worker, she wrote a letter to her family, explaining her decision. "I want to be like Jelena," she wrote simply. "I want to be the person who stands up. I want to be the person who helps, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. Because if she could do it, if she could be brave in the face of such terrible evil, then how can I do any less?" The family shared the letter, and it spread beyond their circle, touching the hearts of people who had never heard of Jelena before. Teachers, doctors, activists, all were inspired by the young woman's words, by the idea that courage could be passed down like an heirloom, shaping the lives of future generations. Jelena's legacy had become more than just a story. It had become a call to action, a reminder that each of us, in our own way, has the power to choose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, action over complacency. In Israel, a group of young volunteers created a project called Jelena's Light, dedicated to supporting Holocaust survivors and sharing the stories of lesser-known heroes like Jelena. They traveled to schools and community centers, speaking about Jelena's courage, about how one person could make a difference. They planted trees in her honor, each one symbolizing a life saved, a future made possible. In Serbia, Jelena's name became synonymous with strength and resilience. A children's library in Nish was named after her, a place where young readers could sit beneath a mural of her image, a woman standing tall, her face serene but strong, and learn not just about the Holocaust, but about the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. Even in Germany, where Jenny had been imprisoned during the war, people began to learn about Jelena's story. A small theater group in Berlin put on a play about her life, depicting her final confrontation with the Gestapo, her unbreakable spirit, her refusal to betray the child she had sworn to protect. The play ended with a single spotlight on an empty stage, the actor's voice echoing through the silence. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is standing up when you are most afraid. The audience, many of whom had come expecting a typical historical drama, left in silence, moved to tears. For days afterward, the local paper received letters from people who had been touched by the performance, who felt compelled to share their own stories of courage, of choosing to help, when it would have been easier to look away. "Thank you for reminding us," one letter read, "that history is not just made by the powerful. It is made by people like Jelena, people who choose love over hate, who choose to protect rather than destroy. May we all find that courage within ourselves." And so, Jelena's story spread, carried on the winds of time, whispered from one generation to the next. It became a part of the collective memory of those who yearned for a better world, a world where courage and kindness are not the exception, but the rule. Because as long as there are those who choose to remember, as long as there are those who choose to stand up, Jelena's light will never fade. It will burn brightly, a beacon in the darkness, guiding us all toward a future where one day the words "never again" will finally truly mean something. And as long as that light shines, Jelena Glavaški will never truly be gone. She will live on, in every choice we make to protect the vulnerable, in every act of defiance against hatred, in every whispered promise to stand up, no matter what. Because that is the legacy of Jelena Glavaški, the legacy of courage, of love, of hope, the legacy of choosing to act, even when standing up means standing alone, and that in the end is the true measure of a hero.